Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening. And as always, thank you so much for supporting the show. We appreciate it very, very much. And if you'd like to support the show, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate. There's a bunch of different options for you to do so. And again, we really appreciate it. And before we talk about this week's show, which, by the way, is another 10 Things episode, this week's subject is John Jay. But before we go to that, I mentioned this at the end of the show, but I want to congratulate you again, Clay, on your stellar performance in the Ken Burns documentary on Ben Franklin. I really enjoyed it, and I thought you added so much, as did our good friend Joe Ellis.
I was so glad to see Joe there. You know, he and I first met in Ken Burns' studio in Walpole, New Hampshire, when Burns was working on his 1998 documentary on Thomas Jefferson, and we've been friends ever since. But really, the friendship got its big boost of electricity during the pandemic when Joe became one of our favorite correspondents, and still is, by the way. And I was so glad to see him. You know, when you sit for an interview with Ken Burns, you don't know who else is in it, and you don't know whether you're going to wind up on the cutting room floor or be in the film at any point, and how he was going to quote you and so on. And so I was thrilled to be in it, and even more thrilled to see one of the people I respect most in American history, Joe Ellis, as a central figure, particularly in the second episode.
There was one story that you talked about telling that you said, it's got to be in the show.
It wasn't. It's this letter that Adams wrote about Franklin, and you know, Adams didn't like Franklin very much, but he said that he was known to everyone, to aristocrats and common people, to valet de chambres and scullions from kitchens, and that everyone who knew him, that he was more famous than in Europe than Leibniz or Newton, and that everyone who knew him from the highest in society to the very lowest believed that he was going to bring about a new golden age. I haven't done it justice, but that's the paraphrase of it, and it's one of the most magnificent things I ever read, and I worked hard to memorize it, and every time I have spoken it, I've choked up, because it tells you who Franklin was. I mean, think of that. This was a world of rigid class hierarchies. And those class hierarchies, by the way, continued in Britain and France until well into the 20th century. When I was at Oxford, the class hierarchy was everywhere you looked. And so we were the first nation that attempted to be a meritocracy. And here's Franklin, who comes out of nowhere as a printer's apprentice and becomes one of the most important figures in the history of the 18th century and is known universally. There's a cult of Franklin, and people look to him in a way they wouldn't look to Jefferson, because you can admire and respect Jefferson, but you can't connect with Jefferson. You can't really connect with George Washington, but you can connect with Benjamin Franklin. And so for Adams, who really envied and disliked Franklin for all sorts of reasons, to say such a thing, I thought this will surely be in the film. And then I had several other, the story that I don't resent this. Of course, you can't resent being in one of Ken Burns' films, of course. But what I was sorry for is that he did not include the story of when Franklin and John Adams in the summer of 1776 wound up in the same
with
bed
the open window
in the end, and the window and the debate about.
That's a great story.
I mean, that would have brought some humor. It was a wonderful two-part documentary, and I just say again, I was absolutely thrilled and honored.
Right,
to be
and
in
it if you haven't seen it, I know the both of us would encourage you. We're running long already, and we haven't even talked about this week's show. We're so pleased to have Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky back. I love listening to the two of you talk. This week it was about John Jay, arguably one of the more neglected founding fathers. And it was great to listen to the two of you. I learned a lot this week and enjoyed it all. So let's go to that show, unless you have a final word, sir.
Oh, just this, that John McPherson of Salinas, California, urged us to do this. We do take suggestions if people have ideas for 10 things, and they don't have to be the founding fathers. This can be anything really to do with American history. We're going to be doing one on Theodore Roosevelt shortly, and we're talking about doing something on the battles of the Native American wars of the American West and so on. But just one quick thing about this. the contrast between a multicultural society and a unicultural society. So Jay was a conservative, and he said this, I've often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give us one connected country, a united people, descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, similar in their manners and customs, etc., etc. This is going to be successful, he said, because look at us, we're of the same stock, by which he meant Anglo-American stock. Here's Hector St. John Crevecoeur, the French philosophe, writing about the United States. He wrote an essay called What is an American? And he said, this is going to work because it's a mixture of English, Scots, Irish, French, Dutch, Germans, and Swedes. It's the very variety of the different peoples from all over Europe who've come to the New World that are going to make it a success story. So from the beginning, this eternal debate in American life, what makes us a nation? On. Isn't that something? And so Jay speaks from an Anglo-American perspective, and Crevecoeur, who's a continental European, both of them left out, of course, Native Americans and African Americans, which adds even more to the extraordinary mix. You know, this thing we're trying to do, David, is have a republic that has welcomed virtually everybody. You know, when you watch the Olympics and that opening parade and you see the Swedes and you see the Finns and you see the French and then you see the Americans, and it's like the United Nations in the American delegation. So there's something that we're trying to do that has an intrinsic nobility, but it's hard, and the fracture lines are showing right now.
Did you hear that?
What?
That murmur?
That may be my furnace. I'm sorry.
I know. I think it's listeners saying, "Go to the show. Go to the show.
Wow.
Go to the show."
Wow.
But you know what? I cut you short.
And wow.
In 30 seconds, can you give us an update on what's going on for you, your cultural tours, etc.?
Yes. So the summer trips are full, but there's still some room in the winter encampments at Lochsa Lodge. One week it's on 2 novels by Dostoevsky, and the other week it's on the return journey of Lewis and Clark. You can find out more at jeffersonhour.com. I'm teaching this course now on the Enlightenment and its discontents, and I'm absolutely loving that. Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Candide. And then I'm going to be doing one, David, on 10 iconic photographs and their backstories. You know, for example, the Napalm Girl photograph from Vietnam, and photographs of that Muhammad Ali looming over.
Oh, that's a great idea.
10
That'll
photographs,
be fascinating.
And they're incredible backstories, and they're really amazing. So lots of that is still coming. Anyway, I hope people enjoy this program. Lindsay is a great find, but we need to get Joe on the program. You know, he's going to start resenting this young snark.
Oh, I doubt it.
Me either.
I think he's pretty secure in who he is and what he's done. On this subject of your cultural tours and stuff, if people want details, go to jeffersonhour.com, and you should, because most of these fill up fast.
In fact, France is filling up. If you want to come to France at the end of September, do. It's going to be my 3rd time leading a cultural tour to Jefferson's France, and I'm so excited about it. So go to jeffersonhour.com. You'll find all the details. And meanwhile, let's go to the show.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And this week, we are so very pleased to welcome back Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky for another 10 Things episode. And this week, it's about John Jay. I think it's fair to say that John Jay has been a bit historically neglected. So let's start there.
Well, let me begin. 1745 to 1829. So born 2 years after Thomas Jefferson and lived 3 years after Jefferson's death on July 4th, 1826. So they're exact contemporaries. John Jay, I think, is one of the most neglected and undervalued of the founding fathers, partly because he held a lot of different jobs, but never the supreme one of being president of the United States. And there's a reason for that, which we will go into as the program unfolds. But before I turn it to Lindsay, I should say that this program came about by suggestion, and we take suggestions about our 10 Things program. In fact, we're going to do one on Theodore Roosevelt, which takes us a little way out of Jefferson's time. But this was suggested in Salinas, California, by John McPherson, who is the president of the board which oversees the John Steinbeck Interpretive Center there. And I was there leading a cultural tour, and he came up and said, "Hey, love that thing you do with that really snarky person, whoever she is. But he said, with Lindsay Chervinsky, she's fantastic, but he said, will you do one on John Jay? And so I said, of course. So Lindsay, do you agree he's one of the most underrated of the founding fathers?
I completely agree. I think he deserves far more attention. I think he is, in some ways, actually a figure that modern viewers would find more understandable or relatable than some of the other founding generation. I know I'm sort of jumping ahead here, but he had a very warm and loving relationship with his wife. He had a long and valuable relationship with his children. He cared for his family. He was a religious and moral man. I think he had pretty good values. He was brilliant. He was well educated. So there are a lot of things about him that are incredibly appealing. For the purpose of history, the reason I think we should remember him is that all of his contemporaries, the ones that we do remember, like George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, well, maybe not Thomas Jefferson, but George Washington and John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, they all believed he was fantastic, and they believed his opinions mattered and that they wanted his advice and his input. And if they thought that, then we should probably take them at their word.
Let me say the reason why Jefferson found trouble with John Jay is principally because Jay was not a strong advocate of the American West, the Trans-Appalachian region. And for Jefferson, whose base really was the South and the growing West, to be at odds with the demands of Western people, the pioneers in Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio, was anathema. And so Jefferson was really upset when he perceived that Jay was essentially arguing on behalf of the northern states and the Northeast particularly. So Jefferson took it very personally that Jay wasn't as strong a Western visionary as some of the others of the founders. Let me just say before you start us in, David, that Jay, New York is named after John Jay, as is Jay, Vermont, Jay County, Indiana, and New York's College of Police Science is named the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. At Columbia, where he was an early graduate of King's College, there's a residence hall named for him. And when Columbia named its 250 greatest alumni, they placed him first on the list. I'm sure Hamilton is really, really upset, I think, but still.
I approve of their rankings.
We all agree, I think, that John Jay is somewhat of a neglected founding father. One of the reasons for that may be that he, like a lot of the founders, destroyed a great deal of his personal correspondence.
There are certainly fewer, and they're less organized than, previously had been less organized. There is a John Jay editorial project, which is doing heroes work to try and bring this material to light and make it more accessible to researchers and historians. A lot of his correspondence is available in the paper collections of other people. So, for example, earlier this week, I was going through Timothy Pickering's papers, and John Jay and Timothy Pickering regularly exchange letters. And as a side note, if you have the opportunity to look at John Jay's letters, they are a historian's dream because they are so beautiful and so clear, and his handwriting is so lovely, and it makes our jobs so much easier when you can read what they're saying. So I do think that in some ways, his reputation has been slightly harmed by just less of the material record that is available.
But let's talk also about his capacity as a writer. When you think of the quotable founding fathers, who's the most quotable of all the founding fathers? Bing, 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 bing. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, George Washington. They are all more memorable prose stylists than John Jay. Name one John Jay quotation that deserves to be remembered. There isn't one. And I think it has to be said that history belongs to the great writers in some respects. And Jay was a good prose stylist, very correct, but he doesn't have a single magnificent quotation.
No, I don't disagree. I think that the best way to think about his brain and the writing that he produced was he had what we would consider today to be judicial temperament. He was a brilliant thinker. He was a very rational thinker. He understood the complexities of diplomacy and the law, but he wasn't necessarily a political theorist or a poet or a writer, as you said. And so much of his brilliance is actually seen in substance, but you're right, it doesn't necessarily, go as well on a sticker.
Well, let's get to the 10 points that the two of you sent me, and I'll present them in the order that you sent them in, which begins with number 1, Jay's complicated relationship with slavery, and it really is complicated.
Well, I should start by saying there's a fantastic new book that I haven't finished yet, but I'm partway through, called Liberty's Chain by David Gelman, and it looks at the entire history of slavery abolition and the entire Jay family. So it starts with John Jay's ancestors, and it goes into his son's generation and his grandson's generation. And what I love about that is it presents slavery and abolition as a family project and a family lineage that they had to grapple with. But what the story does reveal is, despite being a fairly ardent abolitionist in his rhetoric, and in some of his actions, he was supportive of education for formerly enslaved individuals. He was supportive of gradual emancipation. He signed the bills in New York that created for emancipation. He owned people. He bought people. It wasn't like he just inherited individuals from his family and then at some point emancipated them. He actually bought new individuals. He pursued those that attempted to run away, and had a very patriarchal white ownership perspective in that he couldn't understand why they might want to run away. So there are both things that should be lauded and celebrated, but also real limitations.
Let me make the case for him for just a moment. He repeatedly introduced emancipation legislation in New York. Jefferson started off by doing something similar in Virginia and soon got his fingers burned and turned away and began to become more evasive about it for the rest of his long and distinguished life. Jay persisted and actually got the bill passed finally that put slavery on the road to quick extinction in the state of New York. Easier in New York, it has to be said, than Virginia or South Carolina, but still, that's a heroic achievement, and he could easily have given up after doing the right rhetorical thing. He also wrote this may be his most memorable single sentence, that it's very Jeffersonian, except without the hypocrisy, or with less hypocrisy. I made you laugh.
I really needed that today. Thank you.
Oh, good. That men should pray and fight for their own freedom and yet keep others in slavery is certainly acting a very inconsistent as well as an unjust and perhaps impious part. That's strong, and he was part of abolition institutions, voluntary associations of like-minded people. So, the fact that he owns slaves and that he's somewhat complacent about his personal ownership of slaves is a serious blot on his reputation. But you can see that, as you said before, he's a measured man. And I think he realized the fundamental truth that slavery is incompatible with a republic, and therefore it had to go. And he led the charge in his own state of New York and did it successfully. We wish that he would have distanced himself from his ownership of enslaved people, or been more willing to talk about that contradiction. But nevertheless, I think he has to finally appear on the brighter side of this long, agonizing question.
Yeah, before we say goodbye to that part of the discussion, I think it's notable to recognize that it was a Jay family tradition. Both his father and his grandfather invested in slave ships as part of the New York slavery records. And Jay himself, it appears, would have owned in some way or been involved in some way with about 17 slaves during his lifetime. So he grew up with it, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make.
Well, I think what Clay was saying about the measured nature of his approach to so many things is revealed in a great deal by the way New York society was at the time. So to be sure, there were fewer enslaved individuals in New York than there were in Virginia, but New York was the most heavily populated with enslaved individuals of the northern states, especially around New York City, where there was a lot of trade connections with the Caribbean and with the South, and it was a measure of status, it was a measure of prestige, and it was a regular part of commerce. Now, of course, this is not a justification, but it is important to observe all of the ways in which slavery was folded into society, whether it be when he was at King's College, whether it be the family that he married into, as well as his own personal family. And indeed, one of the challenges that he faced when he was abroad on one of his many diplomatic trips was his brother was at home trying to deal with the family, and they had several enslaved individuals who were old and infirmed and were not capable of working anymore. And Jay was pretty insistent that they not be dismissed or sold, recognizing that that was not really fair. And this is, you can see in his letters that he's grappling with how do you treat people who you don't really think of as equals, but you're also not willing to just throw away, which is why his gradual emancipation approach fits with that mentality and fits with the idea that, yes, New York society is moving in this direction, but it takes time to sort of unfold. And that's, I think, how he came to that position.
We need to take a short break. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, a 10 Things discussion about John Jay with the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and our returning special guest, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. And I'm going to move to the second point, which is Jay's role as Chief Justice in Washington's administration.
Let me just say he was the first Chief Justice, so that is an important role because the Constitution was very general about this. Article 3 is not very well defined in the Constitution. And so once Congress began to meet under the new Constitution, it soon passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which set the basic protocols of our U.S. court system. But a lot was going to depend upon the first occupants. And Lindsay, you're the nation's leading expert on this because Washington's cabinet was another one of those norms that was established by the first person who occupied the role. And they have enormous upstream power to create traditions that will last for generations, maybe for millennia. And so Jay's status as the first Chief Justice helped to create a kind of a Supreme Court ethos that has been very successful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And if he should be remembered for anything, there's so many things he could be remembered for, and we will touch on some of the other ones, but this one surely should cement him in the founding Hall of Fame, because there's some evidence to suggest that Washington actually asked him, do you want to be the new Secretary of State or do you want to be Chief Justice? And he selected Chief Justice. He had been the acting Secretary of Foreign Affairs prior, so he really kind of had his choice, and he wanted that position. And he really put his stamp on what the court ended up becoming. At the time, the court was not as prestigious as it is today. You had to do what was called circuit riding. So you had to go to different parts of the country, and it was a terribly uncomfortable experience. It was very dirty. The lodging was terrible. Traveling was very unpleasant. So he didn't particularly like it, and he didn't stay on the court all that long. He was not alone in that until John Marshall came onto the court. Most justices really only served from 3 to 8 years, maybe. But he continued to advise Washington and Hamilton while he was the Chief Justice, and he worked with the court to try and establish political norms, to establish norms of conduct. And that's an essential quality that is really hard to quantify because that firstness is so hard.
Measuredness. I have two things to say to that, Lindsay. Number one, what a surprise you attack circuit riding. Jefferson believes circuit riding is very important because it takes...
That's because he didn't have to do it.
Takes these self-important, pompous men out of the national capital and puts them into the country, makes them go out and meet actual people and see what the country actually is like. I know the Federalists couldn't stand it because they didn't like the people, but Jefferson reinstated circuit riding in the Judiciary Act of 1802 after the Federalists had tried to stop it. Number two, on what you say, agreed, but think if Washington had persuaded Jay to be the first Secretary of State, how much trouble he could have saved for a whole lot of people if Jefferson had never been in that cabinet. Washington's administration would have been a much happier and more satisfying one. Hamilton wouldn't have had to go berserk over Jefferson. Jefferson wouldn't have become the outspoken, sort of not even loyal opposition, the founder of a rival newspaper and eventually a new party. Imagine how different our history would have been if Jay had accepted that appointment.
Okay, so I'm going to say something nice about Jefferson.
Oh, good.
You should not...
don't take it for granted.
Don't count on it being a regular occurrence here.
Yeah, great.
I actually think that Washington's foreign policy, at least up through the end of 1793, benefited greatly from having the two different opinions in his cabinet. I think having a more pro-French neutrality position, which Jefferson... Some people think that Jefferson was not in favor of neutrality. Not so. He understood a war was not possible, but he wanted a more pro-French neutrality. Balancing the more British neutrality that Hamilton espoused was really, really important. And while I think Jay was very level-headed, and I don't think he was nearly as biased as Hamilton was about these things, I don't know that he would have been as neutral. And so I do think Washington benefited from that. Jay certainly would have been less duplicitous, so my niceness does not, go indefinitely. But I am glad that he was the first Chief Justice. It was a good position for him to be in. Although, interestingly, given the opportunity to go back to it, he chose to be governor of New York instead. So it shows sort of what he thought of the position after a few years.
Exactly. So one last thing about this, and that is that John Jay had already had considerable experience in foreign policy because he was the foreign policy secretary under the Articles of Confederation. And so he knew a lot about this, and he had been sent to Europe a number of times in the course of his life, where whether you agree with his treaties or not, he was an extraordinarily fine-tempered and loyal diplomat for the United States.
Well, that's good. Let's move into the next point, which is treaties. The Treaty of Paris and the Jade Treaty. Very different items, very different reactions.
So here's really, I think, where Jay excels. Because as you said, he was an incredibly loyal diplomat, and he had a very good sense of the United States' position in the world. I think he perhaps had the most realistic sense of American influence. Some of the other American diplomats really thought the United States was way more important than it was, and Jay had a real sense that that was not necessarily the case. So he was essential in the Treaty of Paris negotiations. We talked about this a little bit in one of our previous episodes when we talked about how John Adams gave him a lot of credit for the Treaty of Paris negotiations. And Jay was insistent that the negotiations had to start with British observance of American independence, and he was insistent that the United States sign a treaty without the participation of France, which were both, in retrospect, really, really important clauses. So he played a huge role in that treaty. And then the Jay Treaty, which he negotiated in 1794, it was signed and ratified in 1795, got a very bad rap in certain portions of the nation. I maintain that it was absolutely the best deal that could have been had at the time, because the United States had literally no influence. He had no levers to pull or cards to play. And the fact that he received any concessions from the British was nothing short of a testament to his good relationship with the British ministers.
That's, of course, the new orthodoxy for the past 15 or 20 years. The position you take is that the Jay Treaty, however unpopular it was in some parts of the country, was actually the best deal we were possibly going to get, and that he actually got more in some sense than we could have expected since we had no leverage with respect to Great Britain. But this sort of raises the issue of the realists versus the idealists in American history. Jefferson and Wilson belonged to the idealists. Jay and Hamilton, he's a dark realist. Jay and Hamilton and Theodore Roosevelt and others are the realists. And so Jefferson believed that we had what I might even call a sentimental obligation to France, that they had sided with us when we had no friends in the world. They had helped us to win the War of Revolution. We had signed that perpetual treaty of amity and friendship with them. Now the French Revolution was coming, and Europe was becoming very disrupted. And the president sends John Jay of the Supreme Court to England to try to hammer out our very difficult economic and trade relations with Britain, and to settle some issues that had not been settled after the Treaty of Paris. Jay comes back with a treaty that really sticks in the craw of the idealists, because why are we cozying up to Great Britain? We shouldn't even really be giving them any respect whatsoever. They're the tyrannical power that was occupying us with Hessian troops and betraying the people of France who have been our friends. And, maybe we do more economic trade with Britain. Maybe that's more important in terms of our economy. But aren't our hearts supposed to be a central part of the way we do this? Don't we have some eternal gratitude that we must show to France? And by the way, Lindsay, when Jay said we're not going to bring France into the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War, that violated the very treaty we had with France, that we would make no separate peace.
It was the right thing to do for the United States.
Do you think the idealists are important in American diplomacy, or that they really are kind of a nuisance?
I think that they make for terrible diplomats. James Monroe was an idealist, and he was a terrible diplomat. I think that they are an important part of American politics to always push for trying to get closer to the more perfect union. So I think that as long as we don't think that their policies are necessarily always the best policies for the United States in terms of a realist economic perspective, they play a really important role. They just probably shouldn't be doing the negotiations.
David, before you move on, let me just say this probably cost John Jay the presidency. He was so toxic after the Jay Treaty that he was burned in effigy all over the country. He was denounced. The pamphlet wars went on at endless length to denounce him. And so he lost his chance to be a crossover figure that could win enough electoral votes in both the North and the South and the West to be president. And whether he actually wanted to be president is an interesting question, but it wasn't in the cards after the Jay Treaty.
Interesting. Let's move on to the next point, which I think we could probably spend the entire discussion on, and that's the Federalist Papers.
Easy answer for me. He wrote 5 of them. There were 85 of them. He wrote 5 early on and then dropped out of the project. And so the glory goes really to Hamilton, except that Madison wrote 2 or 3 of the very finest essays ever written about American life. But Hamilton was the great water carrier in the Federalist Papers, Lindsay.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think Jay got pretty sick that summer, if I remember correctly, and he had planned to write more and had to pull out. I do think it's important to acknowledge, and that Hamilton the musical sometimes makes a joke about this as well. And in this, I agree with Aaron Burr that just because Hamilton wrote so many words doesn't actually mean that all of those words were needed. Sometimes he could have really benefited from an editor. But nonetheless, he did do a lion's share of the work and carried the water, as you said. And so Jay's role in this is a little bit forgotten. I have read some very interesting research that there were actually some other authors of a few of them as well that people don't know about. So maybe we should do a 10 things on the Federalist Papers, and I will bring out that research and we can dig into it.
And here's what's so interesting about this for me. They wrote this as Publius. They wrote this as an anonymous. A lot of people had a sense of who was involved. And Jefferson's in Paris. And Madison sends him the collected Federalist and pretends that it's just this interesting book that somehow burbled up. And Jefferson knew that Madison was one of the principal authors. And so he writes back this letter, very Jeffersonian letter, saying, not saying, I know you were the author. He's saying, the person who wrote this has created one of the most, one of those Jefferson letters of giant praise. And they both know that each one knows that Madison is one of the principal authors, but it's sort of the Jane Austen world of Jefferson's life that they would never really say that to each other.
So there's an interesting parallel that occurs with George Washington, who actually doesn't know initially who the authors are. And he's receiving copies, and he's asking Hamilton and Jay to send him more copies because he wants to send them on to editors. And at that moment, he doesn't actually know who's writing them, and then, of course, learns later. So that's always a really fun moment in that writing, when you can see Washington being like, yes, this is exactly what people should be saying, and then realizes, oh, of course I agree with them. These are my allies.
You were talking about Jefferson, Clay, and I promised to get back to that. One of your points was this great letter that from France that Jefferson wrote to Jay. But there was some statement that Lindsay made prior to the beginning of the taping of the show that you asked me to remind you about. So I'm doing that.
And so, we have a lot of fun with this. I know Lindsay really loves Jefferson, and she's only doing this to be the devil's advocate. And of course, I think Hamilton is the bee's knees. And so, we're just sort of playing this game. But I did think I heard you say some very supportive things about Jefferson. And I'm going to paraphrase it, but I think it's the same statement in different words. That of all the figures of this era, from 1774 to 1830, the one who rides this whole thing like a surfer, no matter what happens, and always winds up coming out pretty well, the master political strategist of the era is Thomas Jefferson. Washington was already in some trouble in his second term because of the rise of partisan spirit, and he was tired. Adams is a single-term president, can't possibly really be reelected. Burr flames out, Hamilton flames out. Madison and Monroe are probably not president of the United States if it's not for Thomas Jefferson. Here's Jefferson just rolling along through the first 30 years of our constitutional history, and although he has some setbacks, he really nails it.
So that's not quite what I said.
What did you say?
Well, what happened was April 13th is Thomas Jefferson's birthday. And so on that day, I posted a thing online that said, on this day in 1743, Thomas Jefferson was born. From 1775 to 1826, he shaped and defined the world perhaps more than any other person alive. Noted.
I just said that.
Notice I did not say anything about a political strategist. Then I go on to say, I understand and defend his importance and significance. He was also cruel, manipulative, and duplicitous, and I often find him very annoying. Apparently, some listeners did not like this statement and tagged Clay as though my annoyance with Jefferson was going to be a surprise, which I found highly amusing. So anyway, this tweet had, people had a lot of feelings about it, as they do about Thomas Jefferson.
I think it's kind of amusing that you're, let's put it this way, in the first quarter of your life, and you can write a sentence saying, I defend Mr. Jefferson's greatness. Well, I'm sure he appreciates that.
Well, I think my point is that you can, and I like to believe that humans are capable of holding two complex thoughts in their brains at the same time. So I can both say that I think that he is a incredibly important historical figure and worthy of study and understanding and memory, and also that he's not personally my particular favorite. And that doesn't mean that someone shouldn't read about him or that he, should be erased from history books. I just sometimes find him annoying.
I think we should do a program on the 10 most annoying founders.
Works for me.
Who for you is the most annoying founder?
Well, we kind of already talked about James Monroe because he's so self-righteous and boring. So he probably is the top of my list, but Jefferson's going to be up there.
That's good. So we'll plan that one for another time. The 10 most annoying moments, let's say, or the 10 most annoying incidents.
Perfect.
Clay, tell us about this letter that you referred to in your notes.
It's so quintessentially Jefferson, and I can already see Lindsay rolling her eyes, but I'm still going to read a couple of passages from it. It's from Paris, August 23rd, 1785. So Jay is the Secretary of Foreign Affairs under the Articles, and Jefferson is effectively the ambassador to France. And he says, well, there are going to be problems at sea because we are becoming a trading nation. And when you're at sea, you're going to have incidents, and there are going to be impressments, and you're going to have tariff issues and port problems, and it's going to lead to skirmishes and maybe to war. And so I think we're going to need a navy. So Jefferson, this early, is pushing for a United States Navy once we pay off the national debt. But he starts with kind of his one of his lovely agrarian things and says, we have lands enough to employ an infinite number of people. Cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. They're the most vigorous, the most independent, the most virtuous, and they are tied to their country and wedded to its liberty and interests by the most lasting bonds.
Clay, you read that entire passage, and I watched Lindsay, and I don't think her eyes rolled once. We'll give her a minute and take a short break, and when we come back, I want to hear the rest of this letter. Is that all right? Can we do it that way?
Well, I'm getting to it.
Very good, sir. We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back to this conversation about John Jay with Clay Jenkinson and our special guest, Lindsay Chervinsky. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, 10 Things About John Jay with Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky and the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And Clay, I interrupted your fine reading of this letter from Jefferson to Jay. Would you like to return to it?
So I had been saying that Jefferson is offering one of his typical agrarian paeans, this country of virtuous family farmers working in their fields by day and reading Homer in the original Greek, a very typical sort of Jefferson notion, which is not really born in facts and not in the realities, not even the agricultural realities of the United States of his time. But then he says, if we have to choose a mixed economy, I'd rather us go to sea as traders than have us manufacture at home. And he says this, I consider the class of artificers as the panders of vice and the instruments by which the liberties of a country are generally overturned. So that's his anti-Hamilton kind of notion here, that he doesn't know Hamilton yet, but that he doesn't want us to be a manufacturing nation. He wants us to be an agrarian nation, and we'll take our commodities, indigo and wheat and tobacco and molasses and naval stores and so on, and take those raw commodities to Europe, let them have the factories and the engines of artifice, and this will keep us virtuous and will protect us from the kind of growing social and urban and industrial problems of the old world. This is so idealistic as to be essentially nonsense. Jefferson is a plantation owner with tens of thousands of acres and hundreds of enslaved people. He's growing tobacco for the international market. You can't eat tobacco. You can't drink tobacco. This is not the Horatian, Virgilian farmer that he keeps extolling. He's a commodity producer on the backs of enslaved labor, pretending to be a mild-mannered family farmer, Lindsay.
Yes, that would be correct. My response was going to be, how are those products supposed to get to Europe? They can't fly, and they can't just evaporate, which is a skill that I would really like scientists to work on, because I would very much like to be able to evaporate. But neither Jefferson nor our current scientists have yet quite mastered that skill. So, it is very idealistic, as you said. And this was one of the areas where Jay and Jefferson really differed. And earlier you were saying that Jefferson often felt that Jay only represented New England interests. And what I think is so interesting about John Jay is he really didn't live in upstate New York. He primarily lived near New York City, much like Hamilton. And Hamilton, you really see more of the New York City culture, kind of the mid-Atlantic trade industry. John Jay almost feels more like a Puritan than any of the Puritans. He feels more like a Puritan than John Adams. He is more intensely religious. He is more upright in his personal code, although John Adams was perfectly upright, but even more intense in that way. He cared more about New England than anywhere else. And so it's almost easier to think of him as a product of somewhere else, because it helps explain his focus, his intent, his personal code of honor, and his religious fervor.
And my point in all of this is simply that Jefferson was a masterful, persuasive, poetic artist who writes these letters. They must have made people like Jay and Hamilton shake their heads, because Jefferson's extolling this image of the yeoman farmer that he's really pulled out of classical literature, and his capacity to make that one of the central myths of American life continues to this day. Amazing what Jefferson did.
Oh, no, I completely agree. Sometimes, when people will say, did Jefferson or Hamilton win? And what I usually say is, well, Hamilton's vision of the economy won, but Jefferson's vision of who was the ideal American won.
And our national identity, that we're the good guys in the world. We use power very reluctantly. We have no imperial designs. We have a Jefferson mythos.
I mean, how many articles have there been in the New York Times interviewing a random white guy in the middle of the Midwest in a diner about their views as though they are somehow the views of all Americans? Not to say that his views aren't important and don't count. He's a citizen. They count just like every other citizen. But you don't see those same newspaper articles interviewing people who live in an apartment in a city in a place like New York or Los Angeles, because that is not considered the average American.
And you made David choke. We are two privileged white guys in cafes in the middle of America, the kind of people you're denouncing.
We think like everybody, right? All right, let's move on to the next point before we lose.
How dare you?
Yeah, let's move on to the next point before we lose focus here. And that is that John Jay was president of the Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War.
Another one of the many positions he held, and he did his usual good job, but nothing memorable. I mean, no one puts him in the league of George Washington or John Hancock or Patrick Henry.
Yeah, but not an easy job.
In everything he did, he showed enormous competence.
Well, I think what's really interesting about his time in the Continental Congress is, so he was appointed to the New York delegation in 1774. So he shows up when Washington shows up. He shows up when John Adams shows up. They're all meeting for the first time. As an aside, I'd really love to be a fly on that room because that would have just been bananas. But so he is there from the beginning. He serves for many years. A lot of the delegates sort of leave because it's not particularly a fun job, but he stays for a very long time. He becomes president of the Congress. As you said, nothing all that extraordinary, but with extreme competence. And that cannot be a guarantee for all congressmen at that period. And he only leaves that position when he is appointed to go take on these diplomatic missions. So he is another one of these figures whose entire adult life is devoted to public service, and that is commendable.
He's a servant leader. The fact that he's a Christian servant leader and a very, 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 very serious Christian servant leader differentiates him from a lot of the deists who are floating around in this era. Washington is essentially a deist. Jefferson is certainly a deist. Franklin in most moods. Even John Adams talks like a Unitarian and a deist through much of his life. But here's a Christian, John Jay, who's not afraid of this. He's the president of the American Bible Society. He says, if you look up his quotations in any quotation dictionary or website, about half of them are about the need for us to have a Christian consciousness as we pursue the American project.
His religion also informed so many of the other things that we've talked about. It informed his sort of distrust of the French. He had a deep suspicion of Catholics. It informed his approach to abolition. He believed Christianity and morality that was informed by Christianity was inconsistent with holding enslaved people. It informed his commitment to public service. So it shaped so much of who he was, both in terms of a politician, but also in terms as a human.
And he knew that we are fallen. As a Christian, he believed that humanity is fallen and that therefore we should be very careful about putting too much power in the hands of any entity or individual. And he says this, the Bible is the best of all books, for it is the word of God and teaches us the way to be happy in this world and in the next. Most of the founding fathers did not talk like that, but he did.
What about his family life? Is there anything we should discuss there?
Well, what's interesting about Jay is, although he was one of the inheritors of the Jay estate, he came from a very wealthy, very privileged family. He was not the oldest son. And in fact, I believe, if I remember correctly, he was the second to the youngest child. But the reason he took on such a role of importance is because so many of his siblings were born with disabilities. Several were blind or deaf and were unable to support themselves. And so he and his other brother, they were really responsible for taking care of the rest of his family and taking care of the parents as they aged, which was not unusual, but he had to take on a great deal of responsibility. As I mentioned, he married his wife's name was Sarah Livingston from the very powerful and wealthy Livingston family. He was close friends with many of the Livingstons as well as married into them. They had a wonderfully loving and warm marriage. So much so that, and this, differs a bit from some of the people we've talked about before, she refused to stay home when he did his diplomatic missions. She went with him. So she went with him to Spain. She went with him to the Netherlands. She went with him to France. She went with him to England because they did not like to be apart. And lastly, he had generations of children that served in New York politics, served in national politics, served abroad as diplomats themselves. So a really long legacy of Jay service that he imparted to future generations.
And here's a contrast. 6 children, 5 lived to be adults. Jefferson's 6 children, 4 died in childhood, and a 5th died when Jefferson was serving his first term as president. Jefferson said to Maria Cosway, "I was born to lose everything I love." Andrew Burstein has a really interesting book about Jefferson, calling him a grieving optimist. John Jay and Sarah had a much more successful life raising children, and they are clearly a kind of family that we can understand, whereas I cannot understand Jefferson's family life. It's just so deeply patriarchal and sort of incapable of intimacy, I think I would say, of Jefferson, whereas you can sort of recognize the Jays as if you met them in an airport.
They were deeply patriarchal because he certainly, called the shots on a lot of things, but Sarah was a partner in her own way, and the love for their children feels much more modern than oftentimes the letters that we read between Jefferson and his daughters.
For the two of you, I've saved this juicy one for last, if I might present it to you, and that's that John Jay refused to cooperate with Hamilton in changing New York election rules after it became clear that Thomas Jefferson would be elected president.
So quickly, the election system then was much more chaotic than ours, if you can imagine that. Every state had a different system, even different times of the year when they did all this. And so Aaron Burr was a masterful political strategist, and he outdistanced and outworked Hamilton and made Jefferson the winner of the electoral votes in the state of New York. This was in May of 1800, so well before the kind of elections we have in November. And when Hamilton realized that Burr had outgeneraled him and that he had won the state for Jefferson, Hamilton was, of course, appalled by that. And so he wrote a letter to the governor, who happened to be John Jay, suggesting that maybe they should pass a law changing how the electors would be chosen in New York, and it would be by popular vote instead. In other words, they would void the election results that they had, create a new protocol where the Hamiltonians were much more likely to win than Jefferson and Burr. And he said in his letter to John Jay, in times like these in which we live, it will not do to be over-scrupulous. It is easy to sacrifice the substantial interests of society by a strict adherence to ordinary rules. I mean, think of that. We shouldn't be over-scrupulous, and we should not just adhere to ordinary rules. He called Jefferson, quote, an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics. So even his most recent biographer, Ron Chernow, says this is one of the most discreditable moments of, maybe the most discreditable single moment of Hamilton's life, and there are other nominees. But John Jay, bless him, received this letter, and he did not reply, but he did not acquiesce. And on the back of the letter, for his files, he wrote, quote, proposing a measure for party purposes which it would not become me to adopt. Fascinating, isn't it, Lindsay?
Yeah, I mean, this exchange, it really embodies so much of the two personalities. Hamilton was so brilliant and also just sometimes so unhinged. And Jay was so principled and so upright in so many of his decisions. And what's amazing about that election, and I know I will be talking about this much more in the coming years, is how dedicated so many of the figures were to instilling a sense of the importance of sanctity of elections, instilling a sense of the importance of peaceful transfers of power, and recognizing that those traditions had to be cultivated. that they weren't a guarantee, they could not be taken for granted, and they had to be cherished. Adams cherished them, Jefferson cherished them, Jay cherished them.
This occurred in the summer of 1800. The person that Hamilton blamed for this was not Jefferson, although he despised Jefferson. The person he blamed was Burr. And Lindsay, you can see Weehawken, July 1804, beginning to build some momentum right here.
Yes, no, I mean, absolutely. What's I think so important about this Burr moment is it wasn't necessarily that Burr won that Hamilton opposed. It was that Burr went outside of the traditional bounds of political propriety. He campaigned at a time when people were not supposed to campaign. And that's what made Hamilton so mad, is that Hamilton could have campaigned too, but he didn't because he was trying to stick to these political norms. And so that's where their difference in approach starts to develop into real animosity. And as you said, leads to their eventual duel with many off-ramps that they could have taken, but elected not to.
This is such a paradox, isn't it? Because Hamilton wants to behave according to the norms of how a gentleman does not campaign, and yet he wants to have a coup d'etat in New York State to deny Jefferson his victory. And so this is one of the many, many paradoxes of this era, isn't it?
And one of the many paradoxes of Hamilton, of which there are many.
Well, at this point, I was going to offer each of you a chance to give a quick summary on John Jay, but I'm going to take that time back, if I might, because I think it's significant. We should congratulate Clay on this blockbuster performance of the latest Ken Burns documentary on Benjamin Franklin. In fact, I was so impressed, I actually called you, and miracle of miracles, you answered the night that aired. You were just terrific, and I congratulate you and encourage anyone who hasn't seen that documentary to watch it. It's fascinating. It was great. Did you see it, Lindsay?
I did see it. I enjoyed it very much. Clay, we talked a lot when we did our Ben Franklin episode about that experience. Were you happy with how it turned out?
Well, yes, of course. I mean, what a thrill to be in a Ken Burns film, and I got plenty of time, although when I think of what's on the cutting room floor, of course, I lament, as I'm sure you do, that we always want to be that person. But
well, I thought you were pretty darn close, especially in episode 2. But
I didn't say a single stupid thing. That's all I care about. I didn't say a single stupid thing.
Now, that's the place to end the broadcast today. So I want to thank the both of you. It's been fascinating. I've learned a lot about John Jay, and I'm happy that I have.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. This was fun.
We'll see you again soon, I hope. Lindsay.
Yes, we have many 10 things to discuss.
Many more in the works, so we'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826. And this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.